Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure. In the next half an hour, 40 minutes or so, I'm going to share with you some of the learnings from a campaign that took place actually a very long time ago. We began planning the Full Stop campaign in the late 1990s, which many of you looking around the room were children at that point, right? Because you're all very young. So it's a long time ago. And you might be wondering what a campaign that is that old can possibly tell us about fundraising in the 21st century. And I'm hoping to answer that question for you in the next wee while. So here's where you can find me today. You can find me at the Management Centre. You can find me on Twitter. But in the late 1990s, as was said, I was Deputy Director of Fundraising for the NSPCC. The NSPCC still is the preeminent, the biggest, largest child protection charity in the UK. So deals with very difficult circumstances of children who've been abused in a great number of circumstances. And this campaign really tried to change the face of child protection in the UK. And there are some very, I'm going to talk about 20 years of fundraising in about half an hour. So there is an awful lot to cover and an awful lot I can't cover. And I will share with you at the end some places where, if you're interested, you can find out more. So the campaign, this is what I'm going to cover for you. I'm going to try and tell you a bit about the story of the campaign. I'm going to talk about capital campaign methodology, which is really the way in which we raise the money. Can I just ask, how many of you are familiar with capital campaigns? So a few. Okay, but I'll try and explain what they are, why they're different, and how they work. I'm going to try and share with you why I think ultimately this campaign succeeded. You'll see as we go through, it didn't quite work according to plan, but it did eventually close having raised £274 million, which is a huge amount of money even today. I'm going to try and tell you some of the things that go wrong with these campaigns, and I'm going to try, and I do mean try, to connect it to your conference theme, whether to be online or offline. But given when we started, many of the online channels simply didn't exist, right? And it's been really interesting for me to think back, how would it be different in the world today? And I'll try and share some of that with you. So we have quite a lot to get through. But I want to start with the story. So how many of you have been to London? Lots of you. That's great, because I had to think back about what London was like in the late 1990s and what actually was going on. I've put up a few photos over there. You might recognise some of them, I'm not sure. The Tate Art Gallery, the London Eye, the Millennium Bridge. These things didn't exist when we started this campaign. These things were created really around the turn of the millennium, where there was a great deal of thinking going on about renewal and change. And in a way, that context is actually what started the NSPCC thinking. And the NSPCC started to have its own conversation about, if the millennium was turning, and this was a real moment in history, what was it that we could do for children? What difference could we really make? And in a way, that's where the beginnings of the campaign came from, that sort of big thinking. And the founder of the NSPCC is over 100 years old, and was founded by a man called the Reverend Benjamin Waugh. And one of the things he had said at the very founding was, we shouldn't do something for children, we should do the very best we can. And thinking about what the very best we can might be was where we started to come up with the idea that formed the basis of the campaign, which was that if we were to do the best, we should try to end cruelty to children. Now that sounds like it was an extraordinary, extraordinary idea. An ambition that at the time very few charities were talking about ending things, doing something permanent, making a substantial social change in this way. So it was a whole new idea. What we knew was if we were going to do something that large, we needed a lot of money, right? A lot of money. We didn't really know what we were going to spend it on at the time either, but that's a whole other story. We knew we needed a lot of money. And we started talking about, well, what was a lot of money? And we knew that the Royal Opera House had an appeal for something like 100 million. We knew that the universities of Oxford and Cambridge were doing very large appeals. And the number 250 million was kind of mentioned. It stuck. It had no basis in reality at all, but it stuck as an ambition. And as I'll talk about quite a lot more as we go on, one of the things that happened, it would be nice to say it was all planned and completely thought through, but I'm not sure I can actually say that, was that we turned this campaign into the cause of the moment. It became the single most important cause in the UK for a number of years. And I think that cause of the moment idea is one of the real reasons we succeeded. I'll talk a little bit more about how we did that a little later. We closed eventually, and I'll talk about the time frame a bit more later too, having raised £274 million. That number has not been exceeded by any sort of social cause charity. Yes, the universities raise more. Yes, there are some arts institutions doing very big capital campaigns. But no other charity has succeeded in doing it for a mainstream social cause. And I think that's one of the reasons it's remained very special, and one of the reasons that it is still talked about at conferences all over the world. So I'm hoping to give you a bit of insight into how we did it. You will see an awful lot went wrong, and there's an awful lot of learning. So I want to say a little bit about capital campaigns and how they work. So a few of you are familiar, but for those of you who are not, if you Googled capital campaign, you would probably be really forgiven to think this was something that American universities did, and only American universities, because that's where you most hear about it. So probably the biggest in the world right now is Harvard, who have just raised $9.5 billion. Their target was $6.5 billion. Now, those are numbers to die for, right? And they're numbers that feel completely extraordinary. And many capital campaigns, you might assume, just come from America and from universities and schools. Well, I think the really interesting thing is they don't. This is kind of the book that inspired the NSPCC. It's a small, kind of not very well known, quite hard to buy these days, but if anybody really wants it, I have one, book called Foundations for Fundraising, written by a man called Redmond Mullin, who is now dead, but was actually the campaign consultant for the NSPCC at this time. And what Redmond's book does is explain that this sort of fundraising is how the great European cathedrals were built. Anybody know where this cathedral is? It's in France. Anybody know which one it is? This is Troyes. And there is a very clear write-up of how a particular form of fundraising basically built this cathedral in the Middle Ages. And actually, the stained glass windows, which I've put a picture up of, are important too, because they're the recognition tools. So in those windows are pictures of groups of people who contributed to the campaign to build the cathedral. So lots of the things we do we think are new. And part of my message is this sort of fundraising has been going on for a millennium. Yeah? So that's where we came from. But what is a capital campaign? So I would normally describe it as a very intensive fundraising effort, usually for a specific amount of money, over a defined time period, for a very specific thing. And that thing is usually what I would call additive. It's usually for something brand new that you hadn't really thought about doing before. And it's important probably to just stretch that out a bit and talk about some of the things that it might be for. So it might be for building, renovating or expanding a building. The cathedral is a great example of that. I'm sure here, you were telling me last night about a museum down the road, which has been built fairly recently. So it tends to be for new buildings, might be for buying land or very major equipment, particularly in the medical science field. It might be an endowment, so to build up a capital sum that you will spend against future operating costs. It might be for a new or expanded service. Or sometimes they're integrated. And what I mean by that is that the organisation's work and probably some new elements are rolled up over a period of time. And that's kind of what the NSPCC's story was. It was about saying, we'll take everything that we're already doing, we'll add up the costs of it, we'll develop a whole new set of services to take our work to a new level, and we'll fundraise for the total of that. And that's what we did. In order to do that, you need one of these. People familiar with this? The idea of a big, hairy, audacious goal. Heard of that before, anyone? So this is an idea that comes from a business book, but the idea is really, it's a bit like a vision, but it's a bit more near term. So it's very often a 10-year sort of goal that allows people to think really, really big. It's probably something that internally you believe is not impossible, but externally people look at sceptically. And I think ending cruelty to children could well be one of those. Yeah? There are tons of other examples. If anybody's interested in any of these, let me know and talk to me in the breaks and I'll tell you a bit more about them. But lots of these organisations, a whole raft of very different ones, have them. Probably the most obvious one is the one in the top left corner. Who's that? And what was his big, hairy, audacious goal? Yeah, so he said, and I am going to read you the exact words because I think they're really interesting and important. But his moon challenge was the nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before the decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely, right? A really clear thing that you would absolutely know whether you'd achieved or failed, yeah? And what I want to say is capital campaigns work best when you have a big, hairy, audacious goal. You don't need to call it that if you don't want to. But it's a nice way of remembering it. Maybe let's just do one more. So the original Google one, I don't know whether anybody knows it, but it was to organise the world's information, make it universally accessible and useful. Now, you can let me know whether you think Google have achieved that or not. But you get the idea. And the important thing is, it tends to be emotionally compelling. Yeah? We can all go, yes, I want to do that. And I think that was one of the really important things about ending cruelty to children. I was head of the major donor department when we started the thinking. And I remember going out talking to then major donors about what we were going to do. And walking into, very rich people's houses or offices and saying, I've come to talk to you because we've got a big idea, we want to end cruelty to children, was not an easy thing to do. And most people would go, that's impossible, how can that be? But then they would say, but of course it's really important, so tell me more. And that's one of the really important things about this idea, is it creates an engaging way to think about it. Yeah? I won't do other examples there for now because I'm conscious of time. But so we know what a capital campaign raises the money for now, but the fundraising is also done in a very specific way. So capital campaigns tend to involve larger gifts. So at the NSPCC, in my time in the early 90s, we had generated our first £1 million gift. The campaign plan was to get 36, right? So in anybody's book, we were going from being, reasonably successful, getting £1 million gift was an amazing experience, but to plan for 36 was something completely different. And often those very big gifts don't come as, a cheque or an online donation. They come as pledges over time. And then here's the really important bit about capital campaigns. They're not about fundraisers fundraising. They're actually about persuading donors, people who give to the campaign, to work together, usually organised as a committee or a board, to then get more gifts. Does that make sense? So you are taking people who are prepared to give to you, asking them to own the responsibility for the target, and then asking them to go out and get you the money. So it becomes very peer-to-peer fundraising very, very quickly. And one of the key successes, and the thing you have to do most, is persuade that group of volunteers that they own the target, not you. Your job as the fundraiser becomes then to support them in delivering it. And that's both complex for the donor. Why on earth would they take on that responsibility? It's also very hard for fundraisers. And I have known very good major gift fundraisers who actually don't really like doing that, because actually you have to give up control and let the volunteers do what they want to do and support them in doing it. And I'll share some stories towards the end about some personal examples of how that worked. So the volunteers are usually organised as a fundraising board or a committee. And there's something very important which is called sequential asking. The idea in a capital campaign is that you secure early on some very, very big gifts. And as time goes on, you move down the gift pyramid, right? So you get your big gifts early, which in a way guarantees the success of the campaign. And as others join, they tend to be smaller gifts. Does that make sense? Some nods? Good. And eventually, you, having done what is called a private phase, where you secure maybe half the target without ever talking to anybody other than probably in a face-to-face one-to-one setting, you go out publicly and you launch to the mass audience and you secure the rest of the campaign in smaller gifts. That's the theory, anyway.